the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O gracious Lord.
Amen. Thank you, Father. So this is the first time I've seen you. We've exchanged a few emails. You graciously agreed to do this for us. Just to give you a little update, we are this week, our assignment was to read chapter 5, but I think before we get there, we had a little hiccup last week in chapter 4. We really got derailed on chapter 4, specifically about the giants. And so I was hoping that we could maybe start there with the giants and maybe kind of untangle our confusion about the giants, and particularly how it fits into your overall project and the basic question of, so what? Okay, like how does this affect the average believer's understanding? Why is it important that not just nerds but everyone understand this? And I was thinking, I remember when I first went to grad school, and I think it was, I forget which professor it was, but he had this quote that has stuck with me all these years. He said, okay, everyone, and this was grad school for religious studies, early Christian studies. He said, okay, everyone, you've made it through undergrad, you've all completed your undergrad, and we're here starting our graduate studies. He said, now in graduate studies, this is where we learn that everything you just learned in undergraduate is wrong. So I feel like, we were joking in this group earlier about, this isn't what we learned in Sunday school, right? It feels like we're a little bit like in graduate studies of Sunday school, and really challenging a lot of what we thought we knew. And so there's a little bit of confusion, and then a little bit of, okay, and how does this connect with my lived faith? So, I'm just going to try to facilitate this evening. We want to hear from you, but I'm just trying to give you a little idea of where we're at. And maybe I've been, I feel like Matt Foley from the Saturday Night Live, because I feel like, all day today I've been in the basement drinking coffee, eating espresso beans, and listening to Lord of the Spirits podcasts all day. And,
I don't recommend that to anyone. That's like,
so I'm kind of nerded out, so I want to turn it over to you.
Yeah. So I'll start with trying to describe, and my second book, we're finishing up the editing now, and it's on violence in the Old Testament. So there's sort of even a deeper dive into particularly the giants thing, because it's related to how we understand the book of Joshua and some things like that in that book. So some of what I'm about to say is going to be sort of a sneak preview of sort of the expansion of that. I didn't go into as much depth here because it sort of wasn't the main focus, right, of this book. So in terms of what we're talking about with giants, I think some of the places where people get caught is, and a big part of what this book, Religion of the Apostles, is trying to do is trying to help people read both the Old Testament and the New Testament from the perspective of the apostles or someone living in the apostolic era in the first century. And so that's very difficult to do, right? Because we've got 2,000 years of other stuff, right? Some of it good stuff, right? and some of it not so good stuff, but we've got all that in our heads. And it's hard to kind of check that at the door and then try to adopt a different perspective when we're reading, especially with a lot of the stuff in the Bible that we're kind of familiar with, right? And so we've got a way we're used to reading it and hearing it over the years. But particular hangups, one of them is that we, of course, as modern people, understand genetics. We know that DNA exists, right? And we have an understanding of ethnicity and race right, among humans, and those kind of ideas. And those ideas, frankly, did not exist in the ancient world in the way that they exist today, right? There are words like "genos" in Greek, but that meant something very different than what race means to like an American today.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes when we're reading this stuff or reading about this stuff, and we come with that perspective, right? So, for example, people come to the book of Joshua and see the giant clans there, and they read it as, well, these are these races of people, right? And so when we read about the fact that there was this sort of demonic sexual immorality involved, we think, oh, well, this is like a hybrid race. They have like hybrid demon human DNA or something, right? We think in that way, but
Yeah.
those are all scientific concepts that no one in the ancient world had when they were writing these things in the first place. And so that could be a trip up. And so what we're actually saying with the giant clans is that in the ancient world, what made you the member of a family or a tribe or a clan or a people group, right, or part of a city was not necessarily who your parents were or what shade your skin was or any of those things. People became parts of clans and tribes and these social units primarily through rituals. So an obvious example in the Old Testament would be ancient Israel, right? Where if you're male and you're going to become part of the nation of Israel, you're circumcised and then you eat the Passover. That's sort of the minimum. And then beyond that, you participate in the other feasts and the sacrificial system. But all of those are ritual things. That's what makes you an Israelite. I don't think you've gotten to the chapter yet, but later on in the book, I point to specific examples in the Old Testament of, in the first generation of Israelites and the second generation of Israelites, there were a lot of Egyptians and Black Africans and people not descended from Abraham in terms of genetics in our modern concept.
Yeah.
But they were still Israelites because they had been circumcised and they had come and become part of Israel. If you were a woman, obviously you wouldn't be circumcised. If you were a woman, you came in by being married to or being the daughter of a circumcised man.
Mm-hmm.
And also later on, more toward the end of the book, I talk about how that's sort of paralleled in the church, right? That continues in the church with baptism instead of circumcision and with the Eucharist instead of the Passover or the sacrificial system, right? How we still have the same concept. That's what makes you a Christian and part of the church, not your race or ethnicity or, right?
I think of, when I lived in Greece for 10 years, and I remember one time very distinctly having dinner with some people from the church. After services, we would go out, and maybe there were about 8 or 10 of us, all very active members of the church and the clergy. And I remember one guy, he was kind of our resident philosopher, and he was saying, that, okay, this is kind of a hybrid approach to what we're talking about. He said, being Greek, okay, part of it is the blood, is in your blood. He said, but that's really not the most important part. He said, he was talking to me. He said, being Greek is, do you speak the language? Do you share the culture? And most importantly, do you participate in the religion? And he said, he was looking at me, and he said, you're more Greek than many of us, even though, genetically, I'm not Greek at all. I'm English, British Isles. But it really struck me, how he said that. And I think there is really this, when you hear some of the stuff out of the ecumenical patriarchate about Hellenism, I think a lot of times as Americans, we really tend to misunderstand, and we take it in a kind of racial genetic sense, and we feel excluded, etc. But I think that's not really what, at least Hellenism is to them, that it's more about participating in a culture which includes religious practices.
Right. Yeah. And so when we're talking about the giant clans and the Nephilim, we're talking about groups whose initiation rituals involved sexual immorality, involved sex acts, and who the kings in particular, as part of the festal cycle, would participate in these sexual activities that were also religious rituals. There was no distinction. This is true through most of the ancient pagan world. So St. Paul in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is having to talk to the people of Corinth about the fact that that has no place in Christian worship.
Yeah.
Right. And we look back at that and we're like, well, duh, right? Like, of course, that's not what you do in liturgy on Sunday, right? But that was not obvious to them because they, being pagans, every religion they were aware of until that point had involved that all the time, you know. But so these particular giant clans had these rituals involved that, and we also know from the ancient sources, when you read these things closely, like First Enoch and stuff, also involved human sacrifice and cannibalism.
Okay.
So these groups, and I know in that chapter I talked about how the word we translate as giant really means more like tyrant or thug or bully, right? So these are clans and groups of people that are like, you know, something out of Mad Max or something, right? Like they're literally, you know, kidnapping and committing human sacrifices and enslaving their neighboring clans and doing these things, and it's all tied together with this demonic worship activity they're participating in, right? And so when, for example, in the book of Joshua, God commands, okay, when you go in there, right, you're allowed to take this land and not that land, you're allowed to do this and that. But then he says, these particular groups, these particular tribes and clans, you've got to get rid of. They have to go. Those, when you follow through the genealogies, those are the giant clans. Those are these groups.
So would it be maybe more helpful if we said, instead of talking about them as clans, you must rid the land of these clans, to translate it for us, you must rid the land of this culture or of these practices that are antithetical to me?
Because contained in that, if a Hivite, right, that's one of the clans, if a Hivite came and was circumcised, right, and went through the process of coming into Israel, he's no longer a Hivite.
Yeah.
Right. He's given up those practices. He's given up those things and embraced the God of Israel.
And so I think of, you know, Jesus's words that the disciples left everything and followed him, walked in his way, meaning they abandoned their previous culture. They abandoned their previous kind of worldview, or this idea of like a total institution, that, and they took on Jesus as the one who's going to create this new culture for them, new practices.
Right. And it wasn't all cultures. It wasn't sort of all other cultures. Right. It was these particular ones with these particular practices. And so it was effectively, there can't be anyone, you can't allow anyone to stay in the land and practice these things anymore.
Okay.
They either need to stop practice these things, right, and leave that culture behind, or if they absolutely refuse, then death penalty for these things they've done.
Right.
Right. And I don't think in the ancient world having the death penalty for like murder and cannibalism and right and you know, rape and these kind of things is way out of line, like way beyond, you know, the realm of where we would see there was some justice in that, especially if the people are given a chance to repent and abandon it and refuse. Right.
So I just want to take a second, everyone who's following along here, if you have any, just to keep it kind of more orderly, if you have any questions or any comments, feedback, you know, please put them into the chat and I'll be keeping an eye on that. If, you know, I kind of wanted to get a sense, is what Father Stephen's saying so far, is it making sense of our confusion that we had last week? Are we tracking with him so far?
Right. So that piece, that's one importance of kind of understanding who these giant clans or tribes are, is being able to understand those stories in the Old Testament. Because you will get atheists, for example, will come up and just say, well, in the Old Testament, God orders genocide.
Yeah.
They will just say that about the book of Joshua. And if you're looking at it from this materialist perspective, and you're thinking, oh, God says that people from these certain ethnicities have to be killed, right? Then that's what it looks like. But if you understand what's going on with the giant clans and the demonic, then you understand what's actually sort of going on there. Now, that atheist could say to you, well, I don't believe in demons and I don't believe in this. And you say, well, okay, but the person who wrote Joshua did.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to assess what he wrote based on his beliefs, not on yours. Right. If you want to say he was wrong, fine. But you think you disagree with the author of Joshua, you can say that. But if you're assessing what he said, it has to come from his own perspective. Right. And
Right.
Yeah.
So now to kind of pull back a little bit, how does this piece, how does it fit into the larger project that you're working on? And then why is it important that the average person understand this? How practically does this connect with the practice of my faith?
Right. So in the larger perspective, the New Testament refers to this. Right. So St. Jude refers to this. He talks about the angels who sinned by chasing after strange flesh. Right. And so if you don't know, what he's talking about, right, that just sounds weird and bizarro, right? But this is what he's talking about, right? St. Peter also refers to this, right? So there's that element. But also, and this is in terms of why it's currently important, is that the second piece of that's also in the book is that the demonic spirits who show up in the synoptic gospels, who Jesus is exorcising from people, right? That's one of the things that sort of shifts between the Old and New Testaments when we're reading it. But there's the book of Tobit, and there's an unclean spirit who sort of harasses Saul, but there's very little like demonic possession and exorcism in the Old Testament, right? It's just not something you see much. And then when you turn over to St. Matthew's gospel, all of a sudden there's all these people possessed by demons, and Jesus is casting the demons out of people, and everyone's saying, oh, if he's casting demons out of people, he must be the Messiah. And it sort of comes out of nowhere, right? And again, beyond just understanding what's going on in the New Testament, right? What's in the book is that the people of the first century AD believed that those demons who Jesus was casting out were the spirits of those dead giant leaders, those dead tyrants, those dead kings in the Old Testament. So why is that important? Well, because there was an understanding in the first century that parallel to what we call theosis or deification or divinization, right? That we, through the life of the church, the sacramental life of the church, through drawing near to Christ, through coming to know Christ, we're transformed, right, into his image. There was an understanding that there was a darker flip side of that people who, through the ritual worship of demons and those rituals they were doing, those horrible abominations they were doing, the lives they were living like that they were also being transformed into the image of the demons who they were following. And so we're essentially becoming demons themselves, right? That's the core of what's behind that story.
I think this touches on something that I mean, this group can tell you, I harp on this frequently, that I think that there's a certain spiritual naivete that we have here in the modern West, where either we're just full on materialists, or those of us who recognize that there's something missing. We recognize that, okay, the world cannot be explained just in material terms. There is a spiritual side. We kind of are a little naive because we think, well, I'm one of the people who get it. I get that there's a spiritual side, but we only see the good. We only see what God's doing, what the angels are doing, what the saints are doing, right? And we sort of deny that there's an evil side of the spiritual reality. And so we have a tendency, I think, to, anytime someone has some kind of spiritual experience, it's de facto good because it's spiritual. Spiritual is good, right? And so I always warn them, like, that's a little naive, that there's both sides in the spiritual world, and not every spiritual experience is necessarily good. So I think that's kind of part of our problem in understanding this, is we don't really have a concept of real evil in the spiritual world.
Yeah, and it also, this deeply impacts how we understand the seriousness of sin. Right, when you see a demoniac in the synoptic gospels, right, they're living naked in the tombs, and it's sort of, they're not human anymore. They're living like an animal, right, like a scavenger. And we don't realize that sin in our lives changes us in that way. I mean, we may have known people who have gone deep into a life of sin and addiction and and gone down that road, and seen that even physically, right, they start to look different, right, and live differently. And
Gollum.
yeah, and yeah, Gollum in Lord of the Rings, right? And this is why sin is so. It's not just, I made a boo boo. Hey, I'm just human. I'm not perfect, right? I made a mistake, right? But sin is serious, and when we let sin into our lives, it's going to affect us. It's going to change us, and that's the flip side then of what happens when we commit ourselves to a life of prayer and to the sacraments of the life of the church, and all these things. How that also then transforms us and heals us, right, and makes us more human. Right, we become more human by becoming like Christ. But the flip side of that is we become less human when we follow after sin and the demons. And this isn't something that just goes away at the end of the first century. St. John Chrysostom, if you read his homilies on the raising of Lazarus, he says in one of them to the people who are listening, he says, you folks have this superstition, he says, where you think that if someone dies a violent death, they become a demon. Right, and we have something similar. There are a lot of people out there in America today who think that, someone dies this violent death, that they come back as a ghost or something and haunt, wherever it was that they died. And St. John Chrysostom says that's not true, but he doesn't say, oh, just forget all that nonsense, right? Because he's not a materialist. St. John Chrysostom says, no, it is people who live lives of sin and depravity who become demons when they die.
Yeah.
Right, so this idea doesn't just sort of vanish, right? It's still there in the fathers. This idea that, in the same way that Christ says in St. Luke's gospel that the sons of the resurrection become sons of God equal to the angels, right? The people who go down the other path become like the demons.
Right.
So yeah, to me, that's what I think the sort of practical import of what's going on with giants in the Bible is it's showing us this horrible, they're sort of the furthest you can go in the other direction, where they're committing these just inhuman, horrific acts, that we can't imagine,
And so the human person is a psychosomatic unity, meaning a unit, a union of soul and body, and that there is this connection between the spiritual and the material, that the spiritual realities actually will manifest themselves physically in the body. We see this in the life of the saints on the one hand, and then, like I mentioned joking about Gollum, but like you're saying also, that evil can also manifest itself physically in the body. So they're not two separate worlds, they're connected, they're interlocked. But let me ask you this then. This is one of the questions in the chat. So if the spiritual reality is kind of tied to the physical reality, what is how do you explain the size factor? So the questioner is saying, I understand that you're saying that giant can be translated as thug or bully or tyrant, but what is the significance then of these references to cubits and to size?
Right. So when the Bible is telling, like, or like when they give the dimensions of Og's bed, right?
Yeah.
The Bible is not telling us someone is a giant in order to tell us that they're really tall.
Okay.
They're telling us that they're really tall to tell us that they're a giant. That's like a symbolic way.
Okay.
And that symbolism is taken from the iconography of ancient Near Eastern cultures. When you look at, probably you can see tons of Egyptian right, wall art, right, all over the internet. You can Google it up pretty quickly. And what you'll see is that when they depict one of the gods, and when they depict Pharaoh, who they considered to be one of the gods, right, they always depict them much taller than, they'll have sort of regular Egyptians and slaves and that kind of thing at this one height. And then a little over twice as tall, you have Pharaoh or one of the gods, right? So that was a way in the ancient culture surrounding Israel to say, this person is divine, this person is a god,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so this happens a lot in the Old Testament. They take these things from the surrounding cultures and sort of invert them and turn them on their head and say, no, that's not a sign that they're divine and wonderful and a hero and glorious. That's a sign that they're evil and demonic and wicked, right? And that happens a lot. They're always taking like language that the Baal worshipers used for Baal and sort of turning it around, right? And flipping it back on them and these kind of things. So it's not it's not that, again, this was a genetic thing that made people taller. I'm Dutch, and we are per capita the tallest people on earth. I don't think we're the most evil. Some people might disagree. If you've ever been to Amsterdam and seen the red light district, maybe we are kind of bad, but I don't think we're the most evil people on earth. So that's not a direct like ratio, but it's a symbolic way of saying, right, where they tell you that Og, the king of Bashan, is the last of the Rephaim, meaning he's the last member of these ancient kings, right, who are sort of now seen as demonic. The Rephaim in what's now southern Lebanon, when someone would die, they would offer sacrifices to the Rephaim, to the shades of Og's people, so that they wouldn't destroy the dead person's soul on its way to the underworld. Right. So they say Og is the last of the Rephaim. They're telling you he's one of these people, right? And when they tell you the dimensions of the bed and how huge it is, right, and it matches this ritual bed, which there again, it's this tip off that he's one of these demonic, wicked kings, and that's why Yahweh, the God of Israel, coming and defeating him on Israel's behalf is sort of this major thing that we still sing about in the Polyelios in the church and that kind of thing, So it's why are we still singing about this dead Syrian king from, 3,000 years ago? Well, because of what he represents.
And again, he's when it says that he's the last of these kings. Again, we would, our mind would tend to go to genetics,
right.
but really he's representing not a he's not passing down DNA. He's the conveyor rather of a culture that is demonic, right? And so he represents an entire culture. He's this conveyor of culture, this repository of an ancient culture.
Right.
That's his significance. So he's the last significant remnant of this culture.
Right. And so he's the last one sort of carrying it on. So when he's destroyed, that, sorcery, right, demonic rituals, all those things are now gone, right? Because he's the last one and he's gone.
So it's not genetic. I feel like we need to kind of underline that.
Yeah, we have to get outside that, and it could be hard.
He's perpetuating a culture.
Yeah, and when I talk about that more later in the book, it's particularly in the context of when St. Paul is talking about the Jews and Israel and that kind of thing, and the Torah and how that all relates, like in Romans and Galatians. That's another place where if we come at it from this idea of ethnicity and race, we're not going to understand what St. Paul's saying.
Yeah.
Right.
So a lot of the questions we're getting here seem to revolve around this idea of how does this affect us today? Like, that's what I'm getting out of a lot of the questions. One question is, so could giants theoretically reappear today? I know this came up also in one of the podcasts. They all kind of are blurred together for me now. But and then one question is, so was World War II, could we consider World War II an example of
Gigantomachy.
Gigantomachy?
Yeah.
And the questioner says Nazi Germany was actively exploring many of these ancient practices, and Imperial Japan, as you mentioned in the podcast, believed their emperor was a god. And there seemed to have been, at least in the past, some kind of sexual practice involving the Japanese emperor.
Japan still does that, yeah. They say the sexual element has been removed, but he still does a ritual where he, at least when a new emperor takes the throne in Japan to this day, there's a ceremony where he spends the night with the sun goddess. And they say since World War II, they say there hasn't been any actual sex involved. Admitting that before that there was. Now they say it just focuses on part of it, which was sharing a meal together. But, sharing a meal and table fellowship and sacrifice, if you understand that biblically,
right,
that's not that much of a change. So in a sense, yes, you could say World War II is Gigantomachy. I don't think God actively, told anybody, but certainly there were Nazi practices that we had to put a stop to, right? And there were practices that the Japanese were doing in the lands they occupied that needed to be put a stop to, right? So in that sense, you could say that, right? And there's an understanding that I try to get at in the book too, in a few places, that we tend to think again we think of sin in terms of like guilt, like this person did that thing and that's wrong and should be condemned and they should be punished for it. But there was much more of a sense, not just that sin would change us, but that it would actually sort of taint the world, right? It would taint the land, it would taint places. People may have had that experience of walking into a place and just feeling like there's something not right here, right? Yeah. And the opposite of that is why we go and bless houses, right? I've told people, sometimes people will ask me, why do you have to come every year and bless my house? And I say, well, have you sinned in the house in the last year? If you haven't, then I guess I don't need to, right? I guess everything's still fine. But if you have it all, sinned it all in the house, I have to come and bless you. But, and so this is why it's sort of like we can't just live and let live, right? Which once you understand what they were doing, right, it becomes sort of preposterous. Right, to our atheist friend who's mad about the book of Joshua. It's like, so they were supposed to come in and settle and just let the cannibals next door, right, keep kidnapping people and sacrificing them to their gods and eating parts of them, right? We should have just let that go on, right? That's the good moral thing to do, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? That if someone's doing that, obviously you have to stop them, right?
You're just being a hater, Father Steve.
Yeah. I mean, really culturally insensitive to others, but yeah, and there are people, unfortunately, but we'll hear about them in the news once in a while, right? Or a true crime documentary. There are people who practice that in their own lives, that kind of demonic evil, right? And do horrific things to their fellow human beings and that kind of thing. And those people who we still have today are examples of what we're talking about. Except in the ancient world, at times this existed at the cultural level where it was completely acceptable for the whole tribe or culture to do. It wasn't just this one depraved individual, right? Who was off doing these things.
Right. I mean, we tend to think in general in individualistic terms as modern Westerners, and even in this case, we tend to think of, oh, he was evil incarnate, Ted Bundy or some one-off serial killer had, maybe we would say, instead of theosis, undergone this kind of demonosis by participating with the demons, had grown more and more into the likeness. But I think in the Old Testament, we're looking, their frame of reference isn't individuals, it's collections, it's collectives, it's cultures. And so the more of the interest is not so much on one individual person becoming evil, but on a whole culture becoming evil and producing evil in those who participate in the culture.
Right. And it starts with tolerating it, right? Where you just let it go on, and then moves to participating in it, and then moves to promoting it. That's sort of the course it takes. And that's, again, why you look at St. Paul in 1 Corinthians and the man there who's committing incest in Corinth, and they're just kind of not saying anything about it. And St. Paul says, you can't let this go on in the church. Either he has to stop, or you have to cast him out of the church until he does.
Because it's polluting not just himself, as we would tend to think of it. We would just, well, that's his choice, he'll have to live with the consequences. No, it's actually polluting the body, the organism of the church, of which he is a member. And there's no way that you can, have a cancerous part of your body and just leave it there and not do anything about it, because it will spread.
Right. And so we're seeing, to continue that metaphor, these giant clans are these cultures where it is completely metastasized.
Yeah.
Right. And it's filled the whole thing. And so if there is any healthy member, it has to be separated from the rest, or it won't be healthy for very long. And yeah, so that's the idea. And that's why there's this distinction made in Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua of, no, these certain groups, it has gone too far.
Yeah.
And it has to stop now.
I
And
think
God uses the language, the cup of their iniquity is full. Like it's all the way to the top. These other cultures are probably doing bad things too, but they're not at that point. And so God can continue to be patient with them, right? Call them to repentance through the Israelites, right? They're still, but when it gets to a certain point, and you can't just let it go on anymore, because they're making more victims. Right. And God's love for the people they're victimizing eventually overwhelms his love for the perpetrator, to where the perpetrator has to stop. So,
okay, just to reconnect with the here and now.
Yeah.
What kind of, so understanding this now, understanding what's happening in the Old Testament, how does that help us as believers living in our context today? I mean, I'm tempted to jump to a lot of different conclusions about, how we should approach cultures that have some inherently evil practices, right? So what do you think about that? How should that inform us as Christians today?
Yeah, well, if you look at what the fathers do with the book of Joshua, right, they understood this, right, this background, right? But when they apply it, they don't say, for example, therefore the Christian empire must go exterminate the Persians,
right?
Because they're Zoroastrians, right? They never say that. What they say is, right, this is how sin deforms, disfigures, right, us. And so each of us needs to go into our own soul, the way Joshua led the people into the land, and find the evil and root it out completely. We can't tolerate it. We can't try to just live with it, right? We can't put sin off in its own little side room and keep the door closed, right? And pretend it's not there, right? We have to, and that's what they all say when they apply the book of Joshua to our lives, right? And so I'm going to follow them. And now I apply that we always apply it. We also always apply it to ourselves.
Okay.
Right.
So
and so I need,
that's a turn to the individual, though. I mean, so already, and I'm guessing probably this starts with Augustine, where there's this kind of introspective turn, and that this is maybe around the time where the fathers start trying to apply these principles to ourselves personally.
Well, it happens even earlier than that. I mean, that's really what even like Origen is doing in his
Okay.
commentary on the book of Joshua in the 3rd century. And yeah, it's see, the difference is they don't see a human as an individual. They see a human as a person.
Okay. Yeah.
And a person and an individual are two different things.
Yeah. Okay. Good point.
Right? Because an individual, I define myself as an individual by everything that distinguishes me from everybody else.
Right.
I am not this, I'm not that, I'm not my parents, I am not. What defines a person is the exact opposite. Right? What defines me as a person is who my parents are, and my culture, and my family, and my faith. Right? It's all of those layers that I belong to that make me a person and define me as a person.
Right. Okay. So this leads us maybe a transition to on the we can get wrapped up easily. I think personally speaking, it's easy to get wrapped up in this kind of analysis of evil, right? And it's definitely important. I think it's naive if we ignore evil and know your enemy. I mean, you can't fight something if you don't know who he is or where he's coming from. But at least personally, I have a tendency to maybe over focus on evil and maybe not so much on what Christ is doing. And you have modern saints like Saint Porphyrios who really try to steer us away from concentrating so much on evil and what the devil is doing and concentrate on what Christ is doing, what God is doing. So maybe this can help a transition to what I think you're trying to do in chapter 5, which hopefully we read for tonight, and the role of the saints. So can you talk a little bit about, maybe the bigger project in your book of, the divine council, the role of these kind of fallen angels or demons, and then the role of the saints? How can we now turn and focus on something that's positive and what God's doing and has planned for us?
Right. And this is really the reason I had to do the other first, right, is that, well, I sort of started with the divine council idea, right? That God can administer the creation all by himself perfectly well. He doesn't need anybody. He doesn't need help, right? But out of love, he created the angelic beings and he created us. And out of love, he shares his dominion over creation with the angelic beings and with humanity on earth, right? That's what he says to Adam right off the bat. Yeah. But also with the angelic beings who are sort of part of the lower part of his administration, right? Yeah. There's, and again, not because God needs that, but because out of love, he shares that. He shares his life, right? So the destiny for which human beings were created was to become part of sort of that administration, to share in the life of God, right? To share in his glory and his rule over creation. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about theosis. But this has a particular relevance. We usually come at theosis from sort of the moral perspective, right? Of moral transformation.
Yeah.
Right. And that kind of thing. But there's also an important element related to the angelic beings. Because what we see in, and this is made pretty clear in the New Testament, is that those angelic beings, who I sort of enumerated at least a bunch of them, right, in the previous chapter, who rejected God, rejected the life of God, did not want to share in his life, did not want to share in his rule. They are sort of cast out, right? They lose those positions. And what we see is that God brings human beings in to sort of fill those positions, right? That are vacated by these angelic beings who rejected him and who fell. And so that's part of what theosis is too. And so you see this all over the place in the New Testament. When Christ says to the apostles, and they say, what about us who have given up all these things to follow you? He says, you'll sit on 12 thrones and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? They're going to have this role. And St. Paul telling the Corinthians, don't you know you're going to judge angels? And St. John in the Revelation says, and this is kind of subtle how he does it, but he talks about in chapter 12, a third of the angels having fallen. And then if you go back to Deuteronomy 32, right, the nations are numbered according to the sons of God, which is 70 or 72. Well, if you take a third of that, that's 24. And lo and behold, when St. John sees the scene of heavenly worship, he sees all the angels that Isaiah and Ezekiel saw, and he also sees these 24 human elders. Right. So he's not saying, oh, there's only 24 saints, right? Or there's only 24 humans who get saved. But he's using those numbers symbolically to show that replacement. Right. And we see that in the iconography of our churches. When you look at the tabernacle and the temple, they had these cherubim and angelic beings sort of all around inside the tabernacle and the temple. And now we still have iconography of angels. And we also have the saints in glory there with them, right, in the heavenly places. And from that, there are then specific passages that I go through in chapter 5, talking about the intercessions of the saints in glory, of what they're doing there. They're not just sort of sitting on a cloud with a harp, right? Or going and helping George Bailey learn to love Christmas or whatever. They're actively, right, interceding. And then in that chapter, I also talk about a couple particular cases of the Theotokos and St. John the Forerunner in relation to that. And I think that's the chapter where I talk about baptism for the dead and the
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, in terms of early evidence of patron saints, right, and saints' names already in the New Testament.
All right, so going forward now, what can you tell us what kind of pitfalls maybe have you seen other readers groups fall into with the rest of the book? They maybe give us a little heads up warning.
The giants thing is the biggest one.
Yeah.
People either get really excited about it, and that's not always good, because sometimes they go off on rabbit trails and start looking up conspiracy theories online and crazy stuff. Or they kind of go, wait, what? Like, what? So that's probably the most controversial part. What I mentioned already is something that I think shocks a lot of people, the idea that ancient Israel was not an ethnic unit. People have gotten so used to talking about quote unquote ethnic Israel that finding out it doesn't exist shocks some people. To give you one particularly dramatic example, the high priest Phineas, who is Aaron's grandson. So he's the third.
Famous for his zeal.
Yes, famous for his zeal. The grandson, the third high priest of Israel. His name is an Egyptian name. Pretty much all of the Levites who are named in the Bible have Egyptian names. Now that makes sense with Moses, right? Because he was like adopted by the Egyptians.
Right.
But Miriam's name is also an Egyptian name. Mariamne is the Hebrew form of Mary Amun, which means the beloved of Amun. So she actually has a pagan god's name in her name. Aaron also has an Egyptian name, but so does Phineas, which is actually Pinihas in Egyptian. And Pinihas is one of the words for a Nubian. It literally means the black-skinned one.
Okay.
And if you read closely in the Torah, Eleazar, who was Aaron's son, married a woman from Put, which is southern Libya today.
Okay.
So he married a black African woman. And there's that. So the third high priest of Israel would have looked to us like a black African, but he was the high priest who was going one day a year into the Holy of Holies, representing the people of Israel.
Interesting.
So that's just one kind of dramatic example, but there are bunches, right, we see along the way.
So again, it's about culture, religion, language, rather than what we think of as DNA, genetics, etc.
Right. Right. And I mean, there are some that we know more about, like Ruth, we know is maybe is a Moabite and is David's great grandmother, right? And there are others. But yeah, even at the beginning, right? Even at the very beginning, if you read closely in the Exodus, it's this mixed group, ethnically mixed, right? That becomes the original Israelites.
Okay.
And then their descendants continue to be Israel, but people are grafted in along the way too. And so St. Paul is really appealing to a lot of that when he's talking about Israel and the church and the tribes and how Israel is being reformed in the church. That's not something that happens separately outside the church, but that's what the church is. So yeah, that's kind of shocking to people, and it's probably somebody out there calling me an anti-Semite for saying it too. But
Right.
that's
Well, I think that's a good point. I find myself repeating a lot here in the South also, that we are the new Israel. We have what they call a supersessionist, theology. I mean,
well, sort of.
Okay, it's
I nuance it a lot because supersessionism properly is like old Israel was cut off and now there's a new Israel.
Okay.
So yeah, I try to be really clear on that and say, no, there's this continuity.
Yeah, okay.
Right. The church, I just say the church is Israel.
Israel, yes, okay.
Just is Israel. So, and part of that is that the word we translate as Jew, right? See, we think ethnically again, right? But the word that's translated in our English New Testament's Jew is actually Judean.
Mm-hmm.
And the province was called Judea because it was the remnant of the tribe of Judah. Mm-hmm. Well, there are 12 tribes in Israel. Right? Israel was never just Judah. That's right. That's a subset, right?
Yeah.
And so all of the prophecies about what's going to happen when the Messiah comes in the Old Testament talk about not just Judah being restored, but all 12 tribes. And so a lot of what's going on and what St. Paul is doing to sort of tease future things in the book is talking about how God is reforming those other northern 10 tribes.
Okay.
And what's going on with them and what that was all about. St. Paul is very precise actually with his wording. And some of that gets messed up in English translation. Sometimes you can't really help it. So here's one you can't really help. St. Paul will sometimes refer to dead, right, without the definite article.
Okay.
And when he does that, he just means dead people, right, in general, right? Sometimes, however, he uses the definite article, the dead, right? And when he does that, he's always referring to departed Christians.
Okay.
Right? So that doesn't come out well in English. Right? So like we wouldn't sing Christ is risen from dead.
Right.
Right? That wouldn't make sense. So we say Christ is risen from the dead, and then we say with himself he has raised up all the dead.
Uh-huh.
Right? And we lose, right? So in the original Greek, in one case, you have Christ is risen from amongst those who are dead, right? And then with himself, he has raised up all of the dead, right? The faithful departed, right? So that's an example where it's hard to do that in English, right? Because of just the way the Greek language works and the way the Greek article works. Other times it's just because they're sloppy, or because they have a theological view that doesn't. And one of those is, well, I'll give you a side. Another one is St. Paul will use the terms body and flesh. When he uses the term flesh, when St. Paul uses the term flesh,
you mean sin nature, right?
Right.
Like,
he's referring to the sinful part of our human nature. And when he
I-
uses the word body, it's neutral.
yeah.
He's talking about like our body.
Mhm.
Right. And so if you don't understand that distinction, you could read St. Paul and read him almost like he's a Gnostic, because he's always talking about how evil the flesh is and how corrupt the flesh is.
Right.
And if you think he means by that, like our physical body, you could go in some crazy theological direction where St. Paul's saying matter is evil or materiality is evil or something.
Right.
It's not what he says. He distinguishes those two. And he also distinguishes between Judeans and Israel.
Okay.
And so that's usually translated, they'll translate the Jews. When he's talking about Judeans, right, the Jews, he's talking about his people from the province of Judea.
Okay.
Right, in the Roman rule. He's talking about Israel, he's talking about the whole people of God.
Okay.
He's got in mind all 12 tribes. He's got in mind everybody, of which Judea is a piece.
So when you're talking about, in his view, again, not our view, in his view, when he's talking about all 12 tribes of Israel, is he thinking in terms of the lost tribes and trying to find the genetic connectors and where they went?
He has no concept of genetics.
Okay. So then, so he means then he means what we would the whole world.
Right, because
potentially,
what happens to those 10 tribes?
They're
scattered among the nations.
Okay.
And so if God is going to call them back, he has to call them back from the nations.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and spoil a little. Okay. So in Romans 11, St. Paul uses this language like that, right? Where he says that Judea has been hardened, right? Until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. And then all Israel will be saved. So once the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, all Israel will be saved. Right? Now, there's only one other place where that phrase, the fullness of the Gentiles, occurs in the Greek Old Testament, the exact words St. Paul uses. And that's in Genesis chapter 48. It's in the Torah.
Okay.
And in Genesis chapter 48, this is at the end of Genesis where Jacob is sort of blessing all of his sons before he dies.
Yeah.
And in 48, before the others, he blesses Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Ephraim is actually the younger one, but he crosses his hands and puts his right hand on Ephraim's head, right? Which you can tell that's a theme all through Genesis. It's always the younger son, right?
Yeah.
Who gets the, right? But so Ephraim, his descendants, right? The largest and main tribe of the northern kingdom was Ephraim. The city of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, was in Ephraim. And when you read the Psalms and you read the prophets, they will refer to the northern kingdom not just as Israel, but as Ephraim.
Okay.
Right? They'll say just Ephraim. The blessing that Jacob gives to Ephraim is, he says, your descendants will become the fullness of the Gentiles.
Ah.
Your descendants will become the fullness of the nations. And so St. Paul sees that prophecy as, oh, what happened to the northern kingdom and them being dispersed was sort of part of God's plan all along.
Uh-huh.
And so now they've become the fullness of the Gentiles. So St. Paul sees that as he's bringing these Gentiles now and uniting them to the remnant of Judah, right? The remnant of the one tribe, and Benjamin, which is the tribe he's from, right? As he's uniting these other 10 to those two, right? With the fullness of the Gentiles, then all Israel, all 12 are saved. The other 10 being reconstituted from.
But so then in that case, the 70 or 72 nations are collapsed into that 10. so that the 70 become become the 12.
Right. But also you'll see even in the New Testament, but the church fathers do this a lot too. Those outside the church are referred to as Gentiles.
Okay. As the church is Israel.
Right. So they're still part of one of those nations.
Okay.
Right. Until they come in and become part of Israel. And they do that ritually because that's how you constitute a people.
All right. I'm just looking through the questions and comments here. One theme I'm getting is, and maybe we'll try to wrap up with this, is do you see any connection? Is the scripture trying to make any connection between the Joshua of the Old Testament, which it's his book that is this very controversial book, and the fact that he shared Jesus and Joshua are, of course, the same name. So do you see any kind of play taking place? Because one commentator here is saying that, that Joshua was commissioned for war, Jesus is commissioned for peace. I mean, do you see any kind of play on these names?
Yeah, the short version is absolutely yes.
Okay.
And there are lots of these connections, and not just in the scriptures, but in our Orthodox tradition. So here's one people may not be thinking about. When Joshua leads the people into Canaan to begin his conquest, right? They pass through the Jordan River, and the Jordan River parts, it separates. Right? So Christ begins his ministry by being baptized in the Jordan River. Right. And if you look at the hymns we sing on Theophany, when we celebrate that, it uses the language from Joshua of the waters of the Jordan parting and turning back. And you may have thought, well, wait a minute, that didn't happen in the story of Jesus' baptism.
Right.
But that's the hymnography is connecting that to Joshua coming into the land to conquer. If you understand, as the early church did, that those demons Christ is casting out in the Gospels, once he begins his ministry, once he begins traveling around the land, right, and casting out these demons, if those are the spirits of those dead giants that Joshua and David killed, right, then he's he's fighting the same enemies, right, those same spiritual enemies, right, those same powers of evil, right, and so those exorcisms are sort of battles that Christ is winning very handily and easily, right, and if you look at where Christ starts in Galilee, right, that area in Galilee around Mount Hermon, that's where Bashan was, where Og was king, right? That's where, and when he starts his vision, St. Matthew has this quote, right? Those in Zebulun and Naphtali who dwelt in darkness have seen a great light. And you're like, why were the people living up north like in darkness particularly, right? Like they're not that far north. They're not like, 24 hours of darkness in the winter, right? But that's what it's talking about, that spiritual darkness, right? This is that land that's still associated with those ancient evils of the past, right? And that's where Christ starts his ministry. So yeah, there are all these connections at all levels, where the way the gospel writers, particularly the synoptic gospel writers in this case, St. John's a little different. There are no exorcisms in St. John's gospel. It's one of the interesting things. There's all kinds of exorcisms in the other three and none in St. John's gospel. So he's saying some different things. But the synoptic gospels very much want to describe Christ's ministry in terms of what Joshua did, that he's coming to sort of reconquer the land from the spiritual enemies.
Because evil had not been obliterated. Evil had remained. Evil even was increasing. And so let's make this the final question. So again, to tie it back to us today as followers of Christ, are we, in what sense are we continuing to fight this spiritual battle of Joshua, of Jesus? How are these, I think you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, and I've said this on the Lord of Spirits podcast before, that we as Christians, in terms of spiritual warfare, not only do we need to be aware of it, right? Because like if you put on a blindfold and walk through a battlefield, the fact that you are ignoring the battle isn't going to protect you. Right? You're not gonna do very well, right? Trying to walk through a war zone, right, without acknowledging the war. But not only do we need to do that, we need to go on the offense, right? We need to go on the offense. And what does that mean? That means, God has sent us out to actively sort of reclaim territory. Right. And that means not just blessing our homes, but praying for our cities.
Yeah.
Right. Going to places in our cities and praying publicly. Right. And actively praying for people. I have heard countless stories, and more since I started talking about this, of people who have had neighbors or places in their community where they were practicing all kinds of occult whatever.
Yeah.
Right. And they'll start praying for those people, and the rituals and stuff they're doing will stop working.
Yeah.
And they'll get up and move, right? or they'll quit, or they'll come to a church and say, what's going on? Right? like that's we need to actively do that. And that starts with what we were talking about with Joshua. That starts with our own heart and our own soul.
Yeah, that's a real.
And then proceeds out from there. Right? These aren't opposed to each other.
In the sense of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, that acquire the spirit of peace and thousands around you will be saved. So start with ourselves, but that's not the end goal. I mean, we start with ourselves because through that we might have a chance of helping the world. But if we ourselves aren't purified, our kind of culture wars probably aren't going to be real effective.
Right. And this is the antidote for the culture wars. Right? Because if you don't acknowledge spiritual warfare, if you don't acknowledge that there are demonic spirits behind these things moving in our culture and society, that you can pray against and fight at that level, what do you have left? You've got politics. What's politics? Force and violence.
Yeah.
Trying to force your will, usually through violence, on the other group.
Yeah.
Right? And that never solves the problem. Right? That makes it worse. That's why the demons are doing this. Right? If they can get one group of humans to go to war with another group of humans and for them to destroy each other, that's win-win for them.
Right.
Right? that's part of their goal, is to pit us against each other. Right? So understanding who our enemy really is. My enemy is not the person who has different political beliefs than me.
Exactly.
Right? It's not the person who thinks differently than me. It's not the person who lives differently than me. Even if they're the most evil, wicked, demonized, giant clan person on the face of the earth, they're not my enemy.
Right.
Right? It's the demons who have led them down that path and helped turn them into that. Those are the enemy of both of us. And so that's who I need to fight to try to get them back. Right? And that's St. Paul does that again and again. I mean, St. Paul, the most powerful example of that is Caesar. Right? Caligula was Caesar for a lot of St. Paul's ministry. And then Nero at the end. Right? And most of St. Paul's people approach to the hideous oppression and wickedness that they were suffering at the hands of the Romans was, we need to take up arms and start killing Romans. Right? And drive them out. That's the solution. St. Paul's solution is, I need to get in front of Caesar by hook or crook so I can try and preach the gospel to him. Because if I can get Caesar to become a Christian, the world could be transformed. And St. Paul didn't manage to do that in his earthly life, but it happened with St. Constantine 250 years later, right? He got there and it was accomplished. So yeah, that I think this is majorly important, that we fight the real enemy, and we fight the real enemy using the right means.
Yeah.
And that will get us past all of this stuff where we've fallen prey just as much as the people we think are sinners have when we go to war with them.
I think that's a great way to wrap it up tonight. Thank you so much, Father Stephen. We went a little bit over an hour. We want to respect your time. We really appreciate you. I know you're probably in high demand, and so we really appreciate you joining our little group here.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being with us, and hopefully, Father Stephen, we can keep in touch. I would really enjoy that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did my best. I was joking with Father Stephen by email that I was going to be the poor man's version of Father Andrew Stephen Damick. I mean, I only have one first name, so already I'm only going to be half as good.
Yeah.
So I
He
tried.
just does that to confuse people. People started referring to us as the Father Stephen. It drives him nuts. He's like,
All right, thank you so much, Father. And guys, we will meet again next week and discuss chapter 6. That's the homework. Now we know we can go ask Father Stephen if we get really tangled up again, like we did before.
hopefully you won't. Hopefully you won't.
All right, we look forward to
Chapter 7 we may need you there.
Which one? Chapter what?
That's where we have a different ontology or something, right?
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I think that'll, well, you can get back in touch with me.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.